All batteries, fire at will. Launch the drones.
The Valorian Dominion had not lost a war in 11,000 years, and Fleet Marshal Torun Vale Kesserin intended to keep that record spotless as his flagship, the dreadnought Absolute Certainty, translated out of hyperspace above the human colony designated Meridian's Rest. The ship unfolded into real space like a closing fist opening, 4 kilometers of obsidian hull and gold filigree, its prow shaped like the head of a coiling serpent, ancient iconography of the Vale Kesserin bloodline etched across every plate. Behind it came the rest of the Second Subjugation Fleet, 216 warships arranged in the Dominion's traditional crown formation, a great curved wall of steel meant to be seen from the ground, meant to be feared before a single weapon fired. Somewhere down there, on a rust-colored world with 3 moons and a single sprawling human settlement of 800,000 souls, people were about to look up and see their sky eaten by an empire that had swallowed 473 star systems whole. Torun stood on the command dais of the Absolute Certainty with his hands folded behind his back, his crimson battle robes trailing to the deck, and he did not bother to sit in the command throne. Sitting was for wars that required effort. This was not a war. This was a formality, a box to be checked before the Dominion's surveyors moved in to catalog the world's resources, and the Dominion's administrators moved in to catalog its population as a new labor tier. He had read the intelligence brief twice on the voyage out, mostly out of boredom, and both times it had told him the same thing in the same clinical, dismissive Dominion threat taxonomy language. Species designation Homo sapiens. Threat classification Class 5 minimal. Technological index Bronze Steel transitional extrapolated. Military capacity negligible. No evidence of orbital defense infrastructure. No evidence of naval assets beyond system local patrol craft. Colony founded 11 standard years prior as an agricultural and mineral extraction outpost. Recommended engagement protocol, standard demand of submission, followed by Category 1 occupation should submission be refused. They have not even raised a planetary shield, said Fleet Commander Asara Duthvelen, Torun's second, standing at his shoulder with her talons clicking idly against the data rail of the dais. She was young for her rank, barely 3 centuries old, and eager in the way young officers were eager before the Dominion's endless bureaucratic peace ground that eagerness out of them. The sensors show agricultural domes, a spaceport with perhaps 40 small craft, what appears to be a water purification array the size of a small moon, and residential structures. No weapons signatures at all, Fleet Marshal, not even ceremonial ones. Humans, Torun said, the word rolling out of his throat with the particular weight the Dominion language gave to its lowest taxonomic ranks, somewhere between insect and livestock, are known for performative gestures rather than substance. I have read of their wars. Centuries spent fighting over strips of dirt with chemical propellant weapons. Children with sticks, Commander, this will not require the fleet's full attention. Open a channel. I want the colony administrator's face on my screen within the hour, on his knees, agreeing to terms before local nightfall. The Absolute Certainty was, by any galactic standard, a magnificent instrument of terror, and Torun had commanded it for the better part of 2 centuries with the proprietary affection most beings reserved for a beloved animal rather than a warship. Its hull was layered in overlapping obsidian plates threaded with veins of gold alloy that were not merely decorative but functional. A distributed heat sink architecture that let the ship vent waste energy from its main batteries, without the telltale thermal blooms that plagued lesser Dominion designs. Along its spine ran the Sovereign's voice, a triple-barreled plasma lance capable of reducing a fortified moon to slag in a single sustained volley, a weapon whose reputation alone had ended 3 separate wars before a shot was ever fired, because no world that had seen the Sovereign's voice demonstrated on a neighboring system had ever needed to see it demonstrated twice. Around the flagship, The 215 escort vessels of the Second Subjugation Fleet arranged themselves in the layered concentric shells of the Crown Formation exactly as Dominion doctrine specified. Outer picket destroyers to screen against surprise translation, a middle band of cruisers to project overlapping fields of energy fire, and an inner court of heavy battle cruisers whose sole purpose was to remain untouched, magnificent, visible, a wall of gold and black that had made 473 worlds weep with despair before a single shot had been necessary. It was, Torun often reflected, less a fleet tea. Hannah religious icon given engines and guns, built across 11 millennia to communicate a single unambiguous message to any species unfortunate enough to see it arrive in their sky. Resistance is not merely futile, it is beneath your dignity to attempt. What Torun could not see, what no sensor sweep of the Second Subjugation Fleet had detected in the 2 full days it took the fleet to translate in system and establish orbit, was that the water purification array he had just dismissed as civilian infrastructure was, in fact, a rotating battery of 6 coilgun turrets disguised beneath ceramic composite housing that mimicked the thermal and electromagnetic signature of industrial water processing almost perfectly. Because it had been engineered by people who understood exactly what a Dominion sensor sweep was looking for, and had spent a decade making sure it found nothing. What he could not see was that the agricultural domes ringing the capital settlement were, beneath their soil and hydroponic racking, hardened bunkers housing 3 full regiments of orbital defense crews, who had drilled this exact scenario over 400 times in simulation. What he could not see, because it was tucked behind the vast banded bulk of the gas giant Coriolanus Prime on the system's outer edge, radiating cold and quiet and utterly unremarkable, was the entire Third Fleet of the Sol Defense Compact, 141 vessels running so dark and so cold that they registered on Dominion long-range sensors as nothing more than an unusually large cluster of icy debris in the gas giant's Trojan point. Meridian's Rest was not a colony. Meridian's Rest was bait, and it had been bait since the day the first human survey ship detected the characteristic hyperspace wake signature of a Dominion scout drone 11 years earlier, quietly cataloging this remote arm of human-explored space for a future Dominion incursion that everyone in the Sol Defense Compact's Strategic Planning Division had known, with grim and patient certainty, was coming eventually. Humanity had made first contact with 4 other spacefaring civilizations in the preceding 40 years. 3 of those had gone reasonably well. The 4th had been the Krivex Ascendancy, a smaller empire on humanity's borders that had made the mistake of testing human resolve with a probing raid on an outer colony, and the Krivex Ascendancy no longer existed as an independent political entity. Word of that had apparently not reached the Valorian Dominion, or had reached them filtered through 11,000 years of institutional arrogance that treated every new species as a rounding error until proven otherwise. Humanity had learned, from that first war and from centuries of its own bloody history before it ever left Earth, that the safest peace was the one purchased by making the price of aggression so catastrophic that no one sane would ever consider it twice. So when compact strategists identified that a major galactic empire had begun quietly surveying the rimward human colonies, they had made a decision that would have seemed insane to almost any other species in known space. They built a trap shaped like a victim. Colony Governor Elena Voss watched the Dominion fleet finish its translation from the underground command bunker 300 meters beneath Meridian's Rest Central Plaza, her hands folded on the console in front of her, her face utterly calm in a way that unsettled the younger analysts around her every single time. She had been a fleet intelligence officer during the Krivex War. She had seen what alien overconfidence looked like up close before, and she recognized its shape now in the elegant, wasteful geometry of the Crown Formation blooming above her adopted homeworld like a flower made of gun barrels. 216 ships. Her staff had projected a force somewhere between 180 and 250 based on the Dominion's historical subjugation fleet doctrine, so the number itself was not a surprise. What mattered now was patience, And patience was the one weapon humanity had learned to wield better than almost anyone in the galaxy. Because humans had spent 10,000 years of their own history learning to wait for the right moment to strike back against things bigger and crueler than themselves. Admiral Reyes, she said into the comm, her voice level, the Dominion fleet has completed its translation and is holding position in high orbit. Formation is textbook crown consistent with our projections. I count 216 hulls, flagship signature consistent with a Vale Kesselring-class dreadnought at the center. From the Third Fleet's command ship, the stealth cruiser Quiet Room, running dark behind the swirling ochre bands of Coriolanus Prime, with every emission baffled down to a whisper, Fleet Admiral Marcus, Reyes allowed himself the smallest exhale of something that was not quite relief, and not quite anticipati. On but sat somewhere adjacent to both. He was 58 years old, had commanded human warships in 3 separate campaigns against 2 separate species, and he had spent the last 11 years of his career preparing for precisely this moment, with the grinding, obsessive patience of a man building a cathedral he did not expect to see finished. Around him, the bridge of the quiet room hummed with the low murmur of a crew that had run this exact drill so many times that real combat almost felt like just another Tuesday simulation. Except for the particular electric quality in the air that came from knowing, this time, the enemy on the other end of the sensor feed was real. Copy, Governor, Reyes said. All batteries confirm cold and dark. Fleet is holding position at Coriolanus Prime, full M discipline, thermal signature suppressed to background noise. We are exactly where we're supposed to be, which is nowhere at all as far as they're concerned. Proceed with Phase 1. Phase 1 was the demand for surrender, and Torun Vale Kesselring delivered it himself, because tradition demanded a fleet marshal personally receive the capitulation of an inferior species, and because he genuinely could not conceive of the meeting going any other way. The channel opened, and on the massive holographic display dominating the Absolute Certainty's command dais, the image resolved into a woman in a plain gray administrator's uniform, standing in what appeared to be a modest civilian office with a window showing rolling agricultural fields behind her. No visible guards, no visible weapons. No visible fear, which Torun noted with mild interest and immediately dismissed as either ignorance or the particular flat stupidity of prey animals that had not yet processed the shape of the predator standing over them. I am Fleet Marshal Torun Vale Kesselring of the Valorian Dominion's 2nd Subjugation Fleet, he said, allowing every syllable the weight of 11,000 years of unbroken conquest. This world and its inhabitants are hereby claimed as sovereign territory of the Dominion. You will surrender all administrative authority, disable any and all defensive systems, and prepare your population for processing and reclassification. Compliance will be met with continuity of basic services and preservation of civilian life. Resistance will be met with orbital bombardment sufficient to render the question moot. You have 1 local hour to comply. Governor Voss looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression, not fear, not defiance exactly, something closer to weary patience. The look of a woman who has heard this speech in some form or another and simply needs to get through the required theater of it, made a small, irritated itch form somewhere behind Torun's eyes. Fleet Marshal, Voss said, I've reviewed your terms with my colonial council. Before I respond, I want to confirm I understand your position correctly. You're demanding unconditional surrender of a colony of 800,000 civilians backed by a fleet of 216 warships, based on an intelligence assessment that classifies us as, I believe your term was, minimal threat. That is correct, Torun said, and could not entirely keep the note of contempt out of his voice at being made to repeat himself to livestock. Your own conduct confirms the assessment. You have no fleet, you have no orbital defenses, you have nothing but soil and buildings and people who will, shortly, belong to the Dominion. I want to be very clear that I heard you correctly, Voss said, and here, for just a moment, something shifted in her face. something that in hindsight Torun would replay 1,000 times and still fail to properly categorize until it was far, far too late, because I want there to be no ambiguity about what happens next and whose decision it was. My answer is no, not because we think we can win a fair fight against 216 warships. We can't, not in the sense you mean. Our answer is no because there is no fair fight here, Fleet Marshal. There never was, good luck. The channel cut. On the Absolute Certainty's command dais, Torun Vale Kesserin stood in silence for 3 full seconds, an eternity by the compressed clockwork standards of Dominion military tradition, processing an emotion he had not felt in longer than most species had existed, genuine confusion. Not at the refusal. Refusals happened, rarely, foolishly, and were always followed by the swift and total demonstration of why refusal had been foolish. The confusion was at her tone. There had been no bravado in it, no desperate theater of defiance meant to preserve dignity before the inevitable. She had sounded, if anything, almost apologetic, the way one might sound informing a child that yes, the stove really was hot, despite having been told so already. Insolence, Asara said from beside him, though her talons had gone very still on the data rail. Shall I order the bombardment sequence, Fleet Marshal? Torun considered the woman's face for a moment longer in his memory, the flat calm of her, the total absence of the panic response he had catalogued across 473 prior subjugations. Something old and animal in the back of his ancient mind, some vestige of the predator instincts that 11 millennia of unchallenged dominance had mostly bred out of the Valorian officer corps, twitched with something that was almost caution. He dismissed it. 11,000 years of unbroken victory did not get overturned by one colony administrator's strange affect during a surrender demand. Order the fleet to advance to low orbital engagement range, he said. I want the water processing facility and the spaceport intact for our administrators. Target the residential districts and the agricultural domes for demonstration strikes. Minimal casualties, maximum visual impact. Let the rest of the population watch their compatriots learn the lesson before we ask the question of surrender a second time. This should not take long. It was, Torun would later understand with the clarity of a man watching his own execution from outside his body, the single worst tactical decision of his 1100-year career. And he made it with total, serene confidence, because the trap had been built, patiently, meticulously, over 11 years, specifically to be walked into by a mind exactly like his. The Dominion fleet descended from high orbit to low orbital engagement range in the ponderous, magnificent formation that had cowed 473 worlds before this one. 216 warships arranged in overlapping shells around the Absolute Certainty like the layers of some vast mechanical onion. Their hulls catching Meridian's Rest's pale yellow sun and throwing back gold and obsidian light across the planet's upper atmosphere. From the ground, it must have looked like the sky itself was closing, like a lid coming down over the world, and Fleet Marshal Torun found a certain grim satisfaction in imagining the terror of the population below watching that descent. Because terror was the correct response. Terror was what 473 other worlds had felt in this exact moment before they, too, learned to kneel. 300 meters below the surface, in the command bunker, Governor Elena Voss watched the Dominion fleet's descent on the tactical display with the same expression she had worn during the surrender channel. And beside her, the bunker's chief tactical officer, Colonel Briggs, allowed himself a small, grim smile. They're moving into engagement range without deploying scout drones, without probing our defenses, without so much as a passive sensor sweep below the visual band, Briggs said. They genuinely believe there's nothing here to find. 11,000 years of never needing to check, Voss said quietly. That's not a fleet, Colonel, that's a religion. Advise Admiral Reyes we are green for Phase 2 on his mark. Aboard the quiet room, Marcus Reyes watched the same descent on a display fed by passive sensor arrays scattered discreetly throughout the system. Tiny stealthed relay buoys disguised as space debris that had been quietly cataloging every detail of the Dominion fleet's approach for the better part of 2 days. Hull compositions, weapon signatures, shield harmonics, engine output curves, the subtle electromagnetic fingerprint of every single warship's point defense grid. Human intelligence doctrine, forged in the crucible of the HFY War, held that the greatest advantage a smaller force could ever hold over a larger one was not superior firepower. It was superior information, deployed with total ruthlessness at the single moment of maximum enemy overextension. Reyes had that information now, a complete tactical portrait of an enemy fleet that had never once imagined it needed to hide anything from a Class 5 minimal threat. "All ships, all batteries, this is Fleet Admiral Reyes," he said, and his voice went out over the tight beam laser network that connected every human vessel and every ground installation across the system, a network so narrow and so precisely aimed that even sitting directly in its path, a Dominion sensor would register nothing but background static. "The enemy fleet has moved into low orbital range without probing our defenses. They believe this world is undefended. In 11 minutes, they intend to demonstrate the cost of refusal by bombarding civilian districts. We are not going to let them reach that 11-minute mark. Orbital Defense Command, execute ambush protocol meridian on my mark. 3rd Fleet, stand by for translation from Coriolanus Prime on my mark. Ladies and gentlemen, we have spent 11 years building this moment. Let's make it count." The first sign Fleet Marshal Torun had that something had gone catastrophically, irreversibly wrong was not in alarms. It was silence, a sudden and total absence of the low background telemetry chatter from the Absolute Certainty's forward shield array. 0.3 of a second before the water purification facility on the ground below. The vast, innocuous, gleaming ceramic structure his own sensor officers had cheerfully dismissed as civilian infrastructure not 4 hours earlier, tore open along 6 precisely engineered seams, and revealed itself as a rotating battery of magnetically accelerated coilgun turrets. Each one the length of a Dominion corvette, each one already tracking, already charged, already firing. The rounds that left those 6 turrets were not explosive ordnance in any sense the Dominion's shield doctrine had been designed to counter. They were solid tungsten carbide penetrators, slugs the size of a ground vehicle, accelerated through a 2-kilometer electromagnetic rail to a velocity that made the question of shields almost beside the point, because Dominion deflector technology, elegant and ancient and perfectly calibrated to disperse energy weapons and stop conventional kinetic ordnance, had never in 11,000 years needed to account for a projectile moving at 3% of light speed. The first slug struck the escort cruiser Faithful Dawn amidships and simply did not stop. It passed through 7 decks of reinforced hull plating, through the ship's primary reactor housing, and out the other side in a spray of superheated debris and vaporized crew. And the Faithful Dawn's reactor containment failed a full 2 seconds later in a silent, blooming flower of white fire that briefly outshone the system's own sun. "Report," Torun's voice cracked across the Absolute Certainty's bridge with the first note of real alarm he had allowed himself in centuries. What in the name of the first ascendant just happened to the Faithful Dawn? "Ground-based kinetic weapons, Fleet Marshal," his sensor officer said, her voice climbing toward panic as data cascaded across her console faster than she could parse it. "The structure we cataloged as a water processing facility, it's a weapons platform. Velocity readings are, I have to be reading this wrong, velocity readings indicate relativistic kinetic ordnance. Our shields cannot." The second and third salvo from the ground batteries struck the light cruiser's endless vigil and piety's reward in the same span of heartbeats, and both ships died the same way the Faithful Dawn had died, punched through like paper, their point defense grids calibrated across 11,000 years to intercept missiles and energy bolts. Simply unable to track or engage projectiles that covered the distance between launch and impact, faster than the grid's own targeting computers could complete a firing solution. Across the Crown Formation, 213 remaining Dominion warships that 4 minutes earlier had been arranged in the serene, magnificent geometry of unchallenged conquest were suddenly scrambling, shield harmonics spiking, point defense batteries swiveling toward a threat vector that made no sense according to any pre-battle doctrine any officer aboard had ever trained under. Because the threat was coming from below, from the ground, from a civilian facility. From a species 473 prior subjugations had assured them, possessed nothing more dangerous than chemical propellant sticks. And then the agricultural domes opened. There were 11 of them ringing Meridian's Rest's capital settlement, vast geodesic structures that had spent a decade quietly growing hydroponic wheat and soy directly above 3 regiments of orbital defense crews and, more importantly, above 42 vertical launch silos apiece, 462 missile tubes in total. And when the dome's outer shells split open and folded back like the petals of some vast mechanical flower. What rose out of the ground was not the crude chemical propellant weaponry the Dominion's intelligence brief had promised. It was a swarm, 462 autonomous interceptor drones climbing on plasma thrusters into the low atmosphere in a formation so dense and so precisely choreographed that from orbit it resembled a single vast shifting cloud of silver light. Each drone barely 3 meters long, cheap, mass-produced, individually expendable, and collectively armed with enough directed micro-munitions to overwhelm any point defense grid built to handle a dozen large missiles, rather than 460 small ones arriving from 460 different vectors simultaneously. Drone swarm detected climbing from the agricultural district, the sensor officer called out, and now there was no controlling the tremor in her voice at all. Fleet Marshal, I am reading independent targeting signatures on every unit. This is not a single weapon system. This is hundreds of individual. Point defense engage, Torun snapped, and across the Crown Formation 200. Red 13 ships turned every available energy turret skyward and began cutting into the rising swarm. And it worked for a while, in the sense that Dominion point defense gunners were extremely good at their jobs and began dropping drones by the dozen, by the score, silver sparks winking out against the darkening sky like a meteor shower running in reverse. Each interceptor drone was, in isolation, a laughably cheap machine, printed by the 1,000 in orbital fabrication yards for a fraction of the cost of a single Dominion energy cell, carrying no more than a modest fusion thermal warhead and a targeting computer barely more sophisticated than a domestic appliance. And any single Dominion officer looking at one in isolation would have agreed wholeheartedly with the intelligence assessment that had labeled this species harmless. But human doctrine had never intended for any single drone to matter. The swarm's true weapon was not any individual machine. It was the emergent behavior of 462 of them flying in a decentralized mesh network that reallocated targets and flight vectors 40 times a second based on which point defense turrets were currently tracking which sectors of sky. A swarm intelligence modeled deliberately on the hunting patterns of terrestrial predator fish that had back on a blue and unremarkable world on the far side of human space. Learned across 100 million years of evolution that a coordinated mass of small, fast, expendable bodies could reliably overwhelm a larger, stronger, better-armored predator that could only ever kill one attacker at a time. The drones peeled off in wheeling formations 3, 4, 5 ships wide, diving beneath the arcs of Dominion turret coverage, rolling and juking through debris fields left by the earlier railgun strikes, using the tumbling wreckage of their own dead as improvised cover the same way the human cruisers would soon do on a larger scale. And every drone the Dominion gunners managed to destroy bought the swarm a fraction of a second of freedom as the targeting computer that had just fired reoriented toward the next threat. A fraction of a second that, multiplied across 462 individual engagements, added up to entire seconds of blind spots rippling across the Crown Formation's defensive envelope like holes torn in a fishing net. By the time the swarm's remnants punched through to detonation range against their targets, Dominion point defense crews had destroyed nearly 300 of the original 462. a kill ratio that would have been celebrated as a triumph of gunnery in any other engagement in Dominion history. And it had not been remotely enough, because the plan had never required the swarm to survive. It had required the swarm to arrive, and 160-some drones, converging on shield generators and sensor arrays with penetrators tuned to the exact resonant frequencies human intelligence had spent 2 days quietly mapping, was more than sufficient to blind and cripple a third of the fleet's forward combat capability before the ground batteries, and the hidden Third Fleet had even finished their opening moves. But 462 drones divided their targeting priority. The instant Dominion defensive fire began concentrating, splitting into smaller autonomous hunting packs of 6 and 8 and 12, diving and weaving on evasive vectors no Dominion targeting computer had a doctrine profile for, because Dominion combat doctrine had been built across 11 millennia to counter large, coordinated capital ship engagements between civilizations that fought the way the Dominion itself fought. With grand formations and honor-bound engagement ranges and weapons systems that respected the dignity of ship-to-ship combat. It had never been built to counter a swarm of cheap, disposable machines whose entire tactical philosophy was that losing 90% of them to reach the remaining 10%'s targets was not merely acceptable but the plan. The surviving drones that punched through the point defense screen did not carry warheads large enough to kill a capital ship outright. That had never been the plan either. They carried focused kinetic penetrators designed to burrow through shield harmonics at precise resonance frequencies. Human sensor arrays had spent 2 days quietly mapping off the Dominion fleet's own defensive emissions. And where they struck shield generators, sensor arrays, and weapon mounts with surgical, patient precision, because the human commanders who had designed this weapons system understood a truth the Dominion had forgotten across 11,000 years of unchallenged supremacy. You did not need to kill a giant to make it stop moving. You needed only to blind it and cripple its hands and let it stand there confused while smaller, faster things finished the work. Aboard the Absolute Certainty, Fleet Marshal Torun Vale Kesari watched his tactical display fragment into a chaos he had no framework to process. Watched the elegant crown formation his fleet had held for less than 11 minutes dissolve into a scattered, bleeding mess of ships veering off pre-planned vectors to avoid drone strikes. Point defense grids overheating, 3 more capital ships. The heavy cruiser's Dominion's reach, steadfast glory, and undying mandate. Venting atmosphere and drive plasma from wounds that should not have been possible against a Class 5 minimal threat, and somewhere in the animal core of his ancient predator brain, a thought surfaced that he had never once in 1100 years needed to think. We are losing. Fleet Marshal, Asarva said, and her voice had lost every trace of the eager, arrogant confidence she had carried onto the bridge less than a quarter hour earlier. Orders. We need orders. Concentrate all forward batteries on the ground installations, Torun said, forcing his voice level through sheer force of 11-century-old habit. Burn the water facility and the agricultural domes to slag. Whatever else this species has hidden, it cannot possibly matter if we remove the platforms delivering it. It was, again, exactly the order the human strategists 300 meters beneath the planet's surface had spent 11 years hoping he would give. Because a fleet marshal who turned his full offensive attention groundward, in a desperate bid to silence the weapons currently savaging his formation, was a fleet marshal whose fleet's rear and flanks were, for the crucial several minutes it would take his ships to reposition and fire, catastrophically undefended against anything approaching from the system's outer dark. Admiral Reyes, Colonel Briggs said from the command bunker, watching the Dominion fleet's formation bend and twist to bring its heaviest guns to bear on the planet, they've bitten. Full offensive posture, forward arc, minimal rearward coverage. This is the window. Copy that, Reyes said, and there was no theater in his voice at all, only the flat, focused calm of a man executing the 11th year of a plan on schedule to the second. All ships, Third Fleet, this is Reyes. Translate. 141 human warships that had spent 2 full days sitting cold and dark, and utterly invisible in the shadow of the gas giant Coriolanus Prime, lit their hyperspace drives in perfect unison, and translated into real space directly behind and above the Dominion fleet's exposed flank. And the ships that unfolded into being there were unlike anything in the Dominion's 473 prior campaigns of conquest. Because they had been built by a species whose entire military doctrine forged across a century of near-constant warfare on their homeworld before they ever reached the stars, prized one virtue above all others: the willingness to build the ugliest, most brutally efficient weapon that would actually win, rather than the most elegant one that merely looked like victory. At the center of the newly arrived formation was the battlecruiser Second Sunrise, a vessel that from the outside resembled nothing so much as a vast dark wedge. 3 kilometers of matte black composite hull designed from first principles to reflect and scatter sensor returns, rather than present the honor-bound broadside profile Dominion warship architecture had cultivated for millennia, and mounted along its spine, running the ship's full length, was the single most terrifying weapon system Fleet Marshal Torun Vale Kesserin would encounter in his entire 11 centuries of service: a nuclear-pumped X-ray laser array, a weapon so far outside the Dominion's own energy weapon paradigm that his sensor officers initially misclassified its power signature as a drive malfunction. Flanking the Second Sunrise, the remaining 140 vessels of the Third Fleet spread into an attack lattice that owed nothing to the Dominion's centuries-old traditions of formal engagement geometry. There were no grand shells, no ceremonial escort rings, no attempt whatsoever to present a unified visual silhouette for an enemy to admire before dying to it. Instead, the human ships arranged themselves in overlapping, staggered wedges, heavy strike cruisers pushing forward on aggressive intercept vectors, while lighter, faster corvettes fanned out wide to catch anything attempting to break for open space, and a screen of dedicated electronic warfare vessels hung back at the formation's rear, their hulls bristling with jamming arrays that had, in the span of the last 90 seconds, already begun flooding Dominion sensor bands with false contact returns. Scrambled telemetry and phantom targeting locks designed to make an already reeling command staff waste precious seconds second-guessing every reading on their own displays. It was, by Dominion standards, an almost insultingly ugly formation, asymmetrical, opportunistic, utterly without grandeur, and it was also, Torun would come to understand within the next several minutes, devastatingly effective in exactly the way his own beautiful crown formation had just proven itself to be a liability, because a formation built to be admired had never once needed to survive contact with an enemy that had spent 11 years planning to make sure it never got the chance. Third Fleet in position, came the voice of Vice Admiral Chen Wei aboard the Second Sunrise, calm and clipped over the tactical net. Nuclear-pumped laser batteries charged and ready. Admiral Reyes, we have a clean-firing solution on the Vale Kesserin flagship and 11 capital-class targets, awaiting your order. Fire, Reyes said. The nuclear-pumped laser was, in the elegant, brutal logic of its human engineers, less a conventional weapon than a controlled apocalypse aimed with surgical precision. A small fission device detonated within a housing lined with hundreds of thin lasing rods, and in the femtoseconds before the expanding fireball of the explosion destroyed the housing entirely, the energy of that detonation pumped the rods into an inversion so extreme that each one fired a single, devastating pulse of coherent X-ray radiation before the weapon consumed itself. A one-shot, single-use, catastrophically expensive round that no sane military doctrine would ever consider cost-effective for sustained engagement. And precisely because of that insanity, no Dominion shield technology in 11,000 years had ever been designed to survive being struck by one. 11 pulses lanced out from the Second Sunrise's spinal array in the same instant, each one aimed with targeting data drawn from 2 days of passive sensor, mapping so precise that the human gunnery computers knew the exact resonant frequency of every targeted ship's deflector grid. and 11 Dominion capital ships that had spent the last 4 minutes desperately reorienting their forward batteries toward a planet that refused to stop hurting them simply ceased to exist as coherent vessels. The heavy cruiser Righteous Ascension's shields failed a full instant before the beam itself arrived, and the X-ray pulse punched through 17 decks of hull and reactor housing in a heartbeat, the ship's own drive core detonating a half-second later in a blossom of white fire that swallowed two smaller escort vessels drifting too close in the chaos of the Reformation. The dreadnought Sovereign's Wrath, second in size only to the Absolute Certainty itself, took a direct pulse across its shield generator array, and its deflectors did not merely fail. They cascaded, an uncontrolled feedback surge that arced back through the ship's own power grid and turned Sovereign's Wrath into a 2-kilometer coffin of dead systems and screaming alarms in under 4 seconds. Tumbling out of formation with every light aboard dark save the dim red emergency glow of a ship, whose crew did not yet know whether they were alive or already dead. On the bridge of the Absolute Certainty, Fleet Marshal Torun Vale Kesserin watched his tactical display bloom with 11 separate catastrophic kill notifications in the same 3-second span. Watched the Sovereign's Wrath, a ship he had personally commended for valor in the Threndel campaign 4 centuries prior, go dark and dead and tumbling. And for the first time in his 1100-year career, Fleet Marshal Torun Vale Kesserin felt something he did not immediately have a word for. Some cold animal current running up through his spine that his officer corps had spent centuries training out of themselves because the Dominion did not lose. The Dominion had not lost in 11,000 years, and the word for the feeling, when it finally surfaced fully formed in his mind, was one his species reserved for the accounts of ancient pre-spaceflight history: fear. Fleet Marshal, Asara said, her voice cracking now, all pretense gone, new contacts, 141 signatures translating from the system's outer dark. They came from behind the gas giant. They were behind the gas giant this entire time. Impossible, Torun said, and even as the word left his mouth he understood how hollow it sounded. Understood that impossible was precisely the word 472 prior conquered species had likely spoken in their own final moments of resistance, and understood with the sick clarity of a man watching the walls of his own certainty collapse in real time, that his intelligence assessment, that 11,000-year-old edifice of unchallenged Dominion superiority, had been not merely wrong but had been played deliberately, patiently, by a species whose surrender demand refusal 4 minutes and 30 seconds earlier had not been defiance at all. It had been pity. All ships, Torun snapped, forcing command back into his voice through sheer reflex. Abandon the ground bombardment, rear batteries come about, engage the new formation, hold the crown. The crown was already gone. 216 ships that had descended into orbit as a single magnificent formation 11 minutes earlier were now 201 surviving vessels scattered across a debris-strewn engagement zone, their point defense grids saturated by drone remnants still weaving through the wreckage, their forward batteries locked into ground bombardment configurations that took precious seconds to reorient. Their rear arc stripped bare by a tactical decision Torun himself had ordered less than 4 minutes before. And into that chaos, 141 human warships that had spent 11 years and 2 full days of silent, patient waiting for exactly this moment began their attack run. The human fleet did not fight the way the Dominion fought. There was no honor-bound broadside engagement, no formal exchange of capital ship salvos at respectful range. The lighter human cruisers, sleek matte-hulled vessels a fraction of the mass of their Dominion counterparts, dove directly into the debris field at velocities that made Dominion helm officers' threat assessment computers scream contradictory warnings, using the tumbling wreckage of the Faithful Dawn and the dead hulk of Sovereign's Wrath as cover, closing to knife-fighting range where their own coilgun batteries, smaller cousins of the ground installation's relativistic railguns, but no less lethal at close quarters, could punch through Dominion shields at angles the deflector grids were never harmonized to counter. The destroyer Restless Tide slid past the crippled bulk of Sovereign's Wrath, and put 4 rail-driven slugs through the flank of the light cruiser devoted blade at a range of less than 2 kilometers. And the devoted blade came apart in a spray of superheated debris before its crew had time to register the strike had even occurred. Nearby, the human strike cruiser Ember and Ash cut its main drive entirely and coasted silent and dark directly beneath the belly of the heavy cruiser Dawnbreaker's Oath, close enough that Dominion long-range batteries could not depress their aim far enough to engage it without risking fire into their own formation. And from that blind, intimate range, the Ember and Ash put its entire forward battery of rail-driven penetrators directly into the Dawnbreaker's Oath's engineering section. One slug after another walking a line of catastrophic ruin down the ship's spine until its reactor breached, and the vessel folded in on itself like a dying star collapsing into its own gravity well. Elsewhere in the debris field, 3 human corvettes worked in a coordinated hunting triangle around the escort cruiser Vigilant Eye, one drawing its point-defense fire with a feinting run, while the other 2 closed from opposite flanks and put simultaneous coilgun salvos through its unshielded dorsal hull. A maneuver so far removed from anything in Dominion tactical doctrine that the Vigilant Eye's own gunnery officer, in the seconds before his console went dark forever, reportedly radioed a confused query to his captain, asking whether the enemy vessels closing on them were, in fact, coordinated warships or some manner of malfunctioning debris. Because no serious military force in 11,000 years of Dominion warfare had ever fought with the calculated, patient brutality of predators taking down a wounded and much larger animal from 3 directions at once. What made the human tactics so devastating was not merely their novelty, but their total absence of the ceremonial restraint that governed even the most desperate Dominion engagements. Dominion warship crews were trained from their earliest cadet years to respect certain unspoken thresholds of honorable combat, to avoid firing into already crippled vessels attempting to disengage, to hold formation discipline even under punishing losses, because formation discipline was itself a statement of civilizational confidence that no battle, however costly, was permitted to shake. Human commanders carried no such doctrine, not out of cruelty, but because the entire architecture of their military philosophy had been forged across a species' history soaked in wars that offered no such courtesies. Wars where hesitation born of ceremony had gotten entire armies slaughtered. And so every human ship in that debris field fought with the singular, focused ruthlessness of an animal that understood. On some deep evolutionary level inherited from 10,000 generations of ancestors who had not always been the strongest thing in the room, that a wounded and confused enemy was not an enemy to be given the dignity of a clean fight. It was an enemy to be finished, quickly, thoroughly, and without the sentiment of a formal engagement, precisely because the version of humanity that had survived long enough to reach the stars was the version that had learned that lesson the hard way over and over, until it was no longer a lesson at all but simply the shape of how the species. Les Vaughn. They're using our own wounded as cover, Asara said, something close to awe cutting through the terror in her voice. They're fighting inside the wreckage Fleet Marshal our point defense cannot distinguish. Then target everything, Torun said, and heard in his own voice the particular ragged edge of a commander who understood, on some deep animal level, that the battle was already lost and that every order he now gave was simply an attempt to slow the manner of the losing. Full spread all remaining batteries. I do not care about collateral damage to our own hulks. Burn everything in that debris field. It was an order given from desperation rather than doctrine, and the Dominion gunners, disciplined and skilled even in the collapse of everything they believed about their own civilization's supremacy, obeyed it as best they could, and for a handful of minutes the void above Meridian's Rest became a maelstrom of energy bolts and coilgun slugs and drone wreckage and dying ships. 201 Dominion vessels and 141 human vessels locked in a battle whose scale from the ground must have looked like the sky itself tearing apart, sheets of white and gold and violet light rippling across the upper atmosphere as capital ships died in their dozens. But the mathematics of the engagement had been broken from the very first tungsten slug fired from the disguised water treatment facility, and no quantity of Dominion gunnery discipline could repair mathematics. Every human ship carried weapon systems specifically engineered, across a decade of patient research, to counter the exact shield harmonics and hull compositions of Dominion warships, because human intelligence services had spent that decade quietly acquiring wreckage and sensor data from the handful of skirmishes along the Dominion's furthest survey lines. Small anonymous encounters the Dominion itself had barely logged as noteworthy. Insignificant scouting losses attributed to navigational hazards rather than the opening reconnaissance of a war humanity had known was coming and the Dominion had never imagined possible. Every Dominion ship, by brutal contrast, was fighting an enemy whose weapon signatures, tactics, and even basic existence as a credible military threat had been unknown to their sensor officers 11 minutes earlier. It was not a fair fight. It had never been designed to be a fair fight. It had been designed, with 11 years of patient, ruthless, meticulous planning, to be a massacre wearing the coat of a fair fight just long enough for the trap's jaws to close. 40 minutes into the engagement, with the wreckage of 63 Dominion warships tumbling in slow, silent arcs through Meridian's rest's upper atmosphere and 41 more crippled and drifting, their reactors dark, their crews evacuating in scattered escape pods that the human fleet, with a discipline that struck Torun as almost more alien than the weapons themselves, made no attempt to fire upon. Fleet Marshal Torun Vale Kesserin stood on the bridge of the absolute certainty amid the smell of scorched insulation and the wail of damage control klaxons, and understood with the total clarity of a man who has run out of options that his fleet was not merely losing. It was finished. The absolute certainty itself had taken 3 direct hits, one from a ground-based railgun slug that had punched clean through its outer shield harmonics into the secondary hull and killed 40 crew in the ship's forward armory, and 2 from human coilgun fire during a close engagement with the cruiser's second Sunrise's escort screen that had crippled its primary weapon batteries and left its own point defense running on backup power alone. Fleet Marshal, his tactical officer said, voice hollow with the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent 40 minutes watching everything he understood about his civilization's place in the galaxy come apart. Surviving fleet strength is 112 hulls, of which 31 report critical damage and are combat ineffective. We have lost the Sovereign's Wrath, the Righteous Ascension, the Faithful Dawn, the Endless Vigil, and here his voice caught because the list had grown too long to recite with any dignity. We have lost Fleet Marshal 104 ships, nearly half the fleet. Half the fleet. Torun let the number sit in his mind for a long moment, turning it over the way one might turn over a stone that had just been revealed to conceal something monstrous beneath it. He found himself in that strange suspended interval between catastrophe and decision, running back through every briefing document, every intelligence summary, every casual assumption his officer corps had carried into this system 4 days earlier, searching for the precise moment the Dominion's confidence had curdled into blindness. And he could not find one because there had never been a single moment. There had only been 11,000 years of a civilization that had stopped asking questions the instant it stopped needing to fear the answers. An empire so accustomed to the shape of its own inevitability that it had built an entire taxonomy of galactic threat around the assumption that any species without a visible fleet must, by definition, possess no fleet at all, rather than considering even once. That a species intelligent enough to reach the stars might also be intelligent enough to understand that the most valuable weapon in any arsenal was the enemy's own certainty that no weapon existed. 473 worlds had fallen to the Dominion not because the Dominion was unstoppable. He understood now with the particular clarity that only came in the wreckage of one's own worst assumptions, but because none of those 473 worlds had thought to build a lie this patient, this total, this willing to sacrifice the appearance of strength for 11 long years in exchange for the certainty of a single, overwhelming moment of truth. He thought of Governor Voss's face on the surrender channel, the flat, tired patience in her voice, the absence of any performance of fear, and understood now that what he had mistaken for the dull incomprehension of prey too foolish to recognize its own danger had in fact been the calm of someone who had already run this exact scenario 1,000 times in simulation and knew, down to the percentage point, precisely how it would end. It was, he thought with a species of horror that had no true equivalent word in the Dominion tongue, the single most contemptuous act of mercy he had ever witnessed, because she had told him the truth plainly without artifice, in the very sentence he had dismissed as bravado. There is no fair fight here, Fleet Marshal, there never was. He had simply lacked, in that moment, the humility to hear it as anything other than an insect's futile posturing before the boot came down. 11,000 years, 473 prior subjugations, and never once, not in the founding wars against the Threndel Compact, not in the brutal 3-century grind of the Karsu Uprising, not in any conflict logged in the Dominion's entire martial history, had a single engagement cost the Dominion Navy anything approaching half of a deployed fleet's strength in under an hour. And the species responsible for it had been catalogued, 4 days earlier, as a Class 5 minimal threat by an intelligence apparatus that had apparently never thought to ask the single most important question any predator should ask before attacking. What does it look like when prey has learned to stop running? On the tactical display, the human fleet was reforming with the same terrifying, patient efficiency it had shown throughout the engagement. 141 vessels, having lost only 9 of their own number against the Dominion's staggering casualties, drawing into a loose defensive envelope around the crippled remnants of the Second Subjugation Fleet, weapons still tracking, still charged, still ready. And Torun understood without needing to be told that this was not a fleet preparing to press an advantage into annihilation. This was a fleet that had already won and was, with the same cold calculation that had built this entire 11-year trap, waiting to see whether he had the wisdom left to recognize it. The channel opened on his display before he could give the order to hail them himself, and Fleet Admiral Marcus Reyes' face resolved into view, and there was no triumph in it, no gloating, nothing but the same flat, weary calm Governor Voss had shown him 41 minutes earlier. And somehow that absence of triumph was more unsettling to Torun than any battle cry could have been, because it told him with total certainty that humanity had expected this outcome, had planned for this outcome, had built an entire 11-year strategy around the assumption that he would attack exactly as he had, and had felt no need whatsoever to celebrate the confirmation of their own calculations. Fleet Marshal Torun Vale Kesserin, Reyes said, "This is Fleet Admiral Marcus Reyes Sol Defense Compact commanding the 3rd Fleet. You have 112 surviving vessels, 31 of which are combat ineffective. My fleet retains full offensive capability and has your remaining force fully encircled with no viable retreat vector, as your own sensors have no doubt already confirmed. I am offering you the same courtesy Governor Voss extended to you 41 minutes ago, Fleet Marshal, though I suspect you will find it considerably easier to accept this time. Stand down your fleet, and your surviving crews will be treated according to the Compact's protocols for prisoners of war, which I promise you are considerably more generous than whatever protocols the Dominion extends to species it conquers. Refuse, and I will finish what my ground batteries and my fleet started 41 minutes ago, and there will be no one left aboard your ships to write home about the lesson. The choice, Fleet Marshal, and the account of it in whatever histories your Dominion keeps, is entirely yours." Torun stood on the bridge of a ship that 473 prior conquered worlds had watched descend upon them as an instrument of unstoppable Dominion will, surrounded by the wreckage of half his fleet, by the dying telemetry chatter of crews he had commanded for centuries, by the total and irreversible collapse of an 11,000-year record of unbroken conquest, and understood that there was, in fact, no decision to make at all. Because the decision had been made for him 11 years earlier, by a species that had looked at the galaxy's oldest and proudest empire, and decided the correct response to an invasion was not to hide, and not to run, but to build a world-sized lie so convincing that the Empire would walk directly into its own destruction with its eyes open and its pride blind. Sarah, he said quietly, and his voice for the first time in the engagement had gone entirely flat, stripped of every ounce of the arrogance he had carried onto this bridge less than an hour earlier. Signal all surviving vessels. Power down weapons and shields. We are standing down. Fleet Marshal, Asarva said, and there was something almost like grief in it, the sound of a young and eager officer watching the only military doctrine she had ever known dissolve in real time. 11,000 years. 11,000 years, Torun said, of never once meeting an enemy who understood that the most dangerous predator in any given room is the one who has convinced everyone else, and possibly even itself, that it is prey. Signal the stand-down, Commander, that is an order. The surrender that followed was, by the exacting standards of Dominion martial tradition, a humiliation of a depth and totality that would echo through the Empire's histories for centuries, not because the human fleet demanded anything cruel or vindictive in its terms, but because of the terrible, almost clinical mercy with which those terms were delivered. Reyes did not demand the crews kneel. He did not demand Torun surrender his ceremonial blade, or recite any formal acknowledgement of defeat, or perform any of the theatrical submissions the Dominion itself had extracted from 473 conquered worlds across 11 millennia. He simply had his fleet's boarding parties, calm and professional and utterly without malice, move through the Dominion's surviving ships to secure weapons systems and confirm compliance, treating wounded Dominion crew with the same brisk, competent medical attention they gave their own. And it was that absence of cruelty, more than any tactical genius on display in the battle itself, that finally drove home to Fleet Marshal Torun Vale Kesserin the true and terrible scale of what his empire had mistaken for weakness. A species capable of building an 11-year trap this patient, this total, this ruthlessly executed, and then extending genuine mercy to the very enemy it had just annihilated in half an hour, was not a Class 5 minimal threat. It was not even, by any honest accounting, an equal. It was something the Dominion's 11,000-year taxonomy of galactic power had never once needed a category for, because in 11,000 years, it had never encountered anything like it. A civilization that had learned, the hard way, across its own bloody and violent history, that the surest way to guarantee peace was to make certain that anyone foolish enough to test it would only ever get to make that mistake once. Governor Elena Voss stood in the observation deck of the newly repaired water treatment facility 3 days later, looking up at a sky finally clear of Dominion warships, the last of the surrendered fleet having been escorted under human guard toward a rendezvous point where a formal diplomatic delegation from Sol itself would begin the long, careful process of establishing what the aftermath of this single battle would mean for 473 worlds still living under Dominion rule. Worlds that were, as of this morning, beginning to hear whispered rumors of an empire's fleet broken by a colony the Dominion's own intelligence services had rated a minimal threat. She thought of the look on Torun Vale Kesserin's face during the surrender channel, the particular species of dawning horror that came from a mind forced, in the span of 40 minutes, to unlearn 11,000 years of certainty. And she thought not for the first time that this was precisely why the plan had worked, and precisely why it would need to work again someday somewhere else, against some other empire that looked at humanity's small colonies and quiet frontier worlds and saw in its arrogance nothing more than easy prey waiting patiently to be eaten. As Admiral Ray, E says the last of the boarding operations are complete, Colonel Briggs said, joining her at the viewport. 112 Dominion vessels in custody, 63 destroyed, and not one human casualty beyond the 11 wounded during the drone swarm counterbattery exchange. Command is already calling it the most one-sided fleet engagement in recorded history on either side. It was supposed to be, Voss said quietly, watching the last golden gleam of a Dominion hull vanish over the horizon under human escort. That was always the entire point, Colonel, not to win a battle, to make certain no one ever thinks it's worth starting one again. We didn't win today because we're stronger than the Valorian Dominion. We won because for 11 years we let them believe the opposite and built every single thing we needed while they weren't looking. That's not a victory you get to celebrate too loudly, because the moment you do, everyone learns the trick, and the next predator that comes along won't make the same mistake twice. Word of what had happened above Meridian's Rest would travel slowly at first, carried by the scattered survivors of the second subjugation fleet back through Dominion space, in reports that their own superiors would initially refuse to believe, because an empire that had spent 11,000 years writing its own history as an unbroken chronicle of inevitable conquest did not easily accept a single afternoon's accounting that rewrote the entire premise. There would be inquiries, tribunals, furious debates within the Dominion's highest military councils about whether Fleet Marshal Torun Valekesserin's surrender had been a failure of nerve or simply the only sane response available to a commander watching half his command die in less time than it took to properly announce a formal engagement. And in the end, the truth of it would matter less to the wider galaxy than the bare, undeniable fact at the center of the story. A species classified as a minimal threat had annihilated the better part of 200 warships belonging to an empire that had never lost a war, and had done it without losing a single ship's worth of crew, using weapons and tactics no Dominion strategist had ever thought to plan against, because no Dominion strategist had ever imagined a species patient enough, or disciplined enough, or quietly furious enough at the thought of losing everything to spend 11 full years building a lie large enough to swallow an empire whole. Other species along the Dominion's border worlds would hear the story in the months that followed, first as rumor, then as confirmed intelligence, and something long dormant in those conquered populations, something that had not stirred in generations of quiet, resigned submission, would begin cautiously to wonder whether the Dominion's 11,000 years of inevitability had simply never yet met the right kind of resistance, the patient kind. The kind that did not announce itself with defiance, but with silence and waited. Somewhere in the black beyond the system's edge, the vast dark shape of the gas giant Coriolanus Prime turned in its slow, silent orbit, indifferent and patient, having hidden within its shadow the single deadliest secret in this arm of the galaxy for 11 long years, and would, if humanity's strategists had their way, quietly begin hiding another one soon enough, because the galaxy was very large and very old, and full of empires that had not yet learned the lesson the Valorian Dominion had just paid for in blood and pride and the wreckage of half a fleet, that the most dangerous thing in known space was not a predator. It was prey that had simply been waiting, with total patience and total silence, for exactly the right moment to stop pretending.